depravities that Dante himself doesn't imagine in the Inferno.
Church scandal. Catholics react to explicit details from a landmark grand jury report on clergy sex abuse in Pennsylvania. Appeal denied. The court rules on the American pastor under house arrest in Turkey. We have White House reaction. Behind the scenes, we have a look inside of one of Rome's most unique churches. And Heavenbound. On the Feast of the Assumption, the Holy Father has tips for how to reach our celestial home. On EWTN News Nightly for Wednesday, August 15th, 2018. Good evening from Washington, D.C., and thank you to those of you joining us from around the world for news from a Catholic perspective. I'm Lauren Ashburn. We begin this evening with a deeper look at yesterday's bombshell report from a grand jury in Pennsylvania. The Vatican is declining to comment on the release of an 18-month investigation of the church. It spanned 70 years. The report says 300 priests sexually abused at least 1,000 children. It's being called the most sweeping probe into sex abuse in the church in America. The jury, many of them Catholic, examined 6 dioceses and revealed in graphic detail rapes, sodomy, and mistreatment of girls and boys from 18 months old to teens. It contends there was a culture of cover-up by the hierarchy. Priests were shuffled from diocese to diocese, and some who confessed were returned to ministry. And it found that when law enforcement officials did learn of the abuse, they deferred to church leaders. We are not going to provide the graphic descriptions. The 900-page report can be downloaded on our social media platforms. Some cases highlighted at the top of the report include a priest in the Diocese of Erie who admitted to assaulting at least a dozen young boys. The bishop wrote to thank him for, quote, all that you have done for God's people. The Lord, who sees in private, will reward. In the Diocese of Harrisburg, a priest abused 5 sisters in a single family, despite prior reports that were never acted on. And in Pittsburgh, church officials dismissed an incident of abuse on the ground that the 15-year-old had, quote, pursued the priest and, quote, literally seduced him into a relationship. It's been 16 years to the month since the 2002 Boston sex abuse scandal was uncovered by the Boston Globe. This report acknowledges, quote, some progress is being made by the church. Yesterday, Pennsylvania Attorney General Josh Shapiro introduced victims via a video montage.
I didn't feel comfortable at all. I still don't feel comfortable now in relationships.
I was very unaffectionate. I couldn't show any affection with my wife.
I had no desire to have children. None, because of this.
And while the report acknowledges that victims are no longer quite so invisible, and that it appears the church is now advising law enforcement more promptly,
we don't think we got them all.
The executive summary concludes that the church has largely escaped public accountability, saying priests were raping little boys and girls, and men of God who were responsible for them not only did nothing, they hid it all for decades. Some Catholics across the country are angry, repulsed, and deeply saddened at the claims of abuse. Cardinal Donald Wuerl of Washington, who is accused of protecting abuser priests, is asking parishioners not to lose confidence in the church. Jason Calvi talked to the faithful attending his Mass today at the city's cathedral.
This theology professor says the Pennsylvania grand jury report is worse than the depiction of hell in Dante's 14th century epic poem.
Horror that we are seeing the worst depravities that Dante himself doesn't imagine in the Inferno, at the heart of the priesthood.
The lay faithful at St. Matthew's Cathedral in Washington, D.C. say they're appalled.
As a Catholic, I'm frustrated, and to have these conversations with all of my friends saying, you know, this isn't what our faith is, It's frustrating. It's something that we have to do. Honestly, I just want the bishops to come clean.
What do you think as a Catholic? What do the bishops need to do right now?
Get their act straight. Because I think this, human nature being what it is, from original sin, well, you have weaknesses. So I think they just have to get their act straight.
Today is a special feast day for Catholics, the Assumption of Mary, but many Catholics are mourning, and today, Cardinal Donald Wuerl, who's actually mentioned 200 times in the grand jury report when he was former Bishop of Pittsburgh, asks for prayers.
The pain and the suffering is something that we need to accept responsibility for in helping survivors, their families, and their loved ones. And yes, even the broader community of the church.
Wuerl stopped short of a personal apology. Professor Chad Pecknold says church leaders must take action.
The world knows how to do press releases. The world knows how to hire public relations firms. It's a great temptation to want to limit judgment, to want to limit sacrifices, but don't do that. Don't fall into that temptation. Show the world the one thing that the church has to offer, which is its own penitential wisdom in dealing with her own sins.
Tonight, many Catholics are praying for light in what they see as a time of darkness.
Lord, have mercy.
In Washington, Jason Calvi, EWTN News Nightly.
In the wake of the Pennsylvania report, the Bishop of Fort Worth says prayers from church leaders are meaningless unless they are coupled with concrete action. Bishop Michael Olson was the first bishop to talk to News Nightly about the abuse scandal following the resignation of Archbishop Theodore McCarrick. Bishop Olson says in a statement, quote, "Justice also requires that all of those in church leadership who knew of the alleged crimes and sexual misconduct and did nothing be held accountable morally and legally." In the Attorney General's report, the grand jury lists 4 recommendations saying, quote, "Now we want to leave you, we want something to show for it." The list includes eliminating the criminal statute of limitations for sexually abusing children, which is currently up to the age of 50, urging lawmakers to crack down to create a civil window in Pennsylvania so that older victims may now sue for damages when their bodies were defiled as children. And it says clarify failure to report penalties. The penalties must be clarified for church officials. Finally, the grand jury believes civil confidentiality agreements should not cover communications with law enforcement. Joining me now is Edward Condon, the DC editor for the Catholic News Agency. Ed, welcome to the program.
Hi.
Are these good recommendations?
They're solid recommendations, and let's face it, the church needs all the recommendations it can get right now. I think some are more strong than others. I think some raise questions, but some are no-brainers. Opening up a civil window for older victims to come forward with their stories and seek redress is a solid move. It's something that people want, and I think there needs to be an avenue for justice for these victims.
What about the statute of limitations?
So the statute of limitations, the idea of lifting that for criminal prosecutions is problematic. And the reason for that is this. Everyone wants to see abuser priests face justice. Everyone wants to see abusers generally face justice. But when you're talking about such a backlog of cases, in this report's instance, going back 70 years, there is a real problem of evidence. And it's important that while you allow victims to come forward and you give them a mechanism for seeking justice, you're not at the same time lowering the evidentiary standard and damaging the criminal justice system.
The FBI victim unit came to the grand jury, and I thought this was fascinating. They said that the terms that the Catholic Church used around this abuse are very typical of abuse situations. Can you talk a little bit more about that?
They did. Well, what happened was the FBI came back and said that having examined documents across all 6 dioceses, they identified what they call a playbook for obscuring the truth. And they identified certain behaviors that were a problem. And they're familiar to anyone who works with the church. In some cases, it was employing euphemisms in internal documents and speaking publicly. Not speaking of rape or child abuse, but talking about boundary violations or inappropriate conduct.
And sick leave was one of my
This is another one
issues
of
with the report.
When clergy are placed on leave or removed from ministry because they are facing accusations, the faithful aren't told what's going on. They aren't told why the priest has been removed, but they're told he's suffering from exhaustion or he's going on a leave of absence for his health. And this is something that's happened over a period of years. And it's very damaging, not only because it damages the trust of the faithful in the church, but it makes them suspicious of priests more generally. Because what about when a priest does need to go on a medical leave of absence? All of a sudden it's raising eyebrows in the pews.
Cardinal Wuerl, as we just saw, celebrated Mass today. He's mentioned, as Jason Calvi reported, more than 200 times in the report. He handled several of these cases. What does this report mean for him?
I think it puts him under a lot of pressure. He's already facing severe questions in the Archdiocese of Washington, D.C., because it came to light that there were numerous allegations facing his predecessor, Theodore McCarrick, who was still living in the Archdiocese at the time. I think this doesn't help him at all. I think there are a lot of cases that he can point to in his own history as Bishop of Pittsburgh that suggest stronger action than other bishops in Pennsylvania were taking at the time. But I think the real thing now for every bishop, Cardinal Wuerl included, is recognizing that no one was acting strongly enough and that even the best practice of the time is objectively not good enough.
So what is good enough? The Vatican didn't respond today.
Well, it's understandable that the Vatican doesn't want to respond to this. I mean, this is a problem for the Church in America particularly, and I don't imagine the Vatican have read all 900 pages yet, and it would be, I think, premature for them to get involved.
Okay, but wait 1 second. I'm going to stop you there because it's 900 pages. I was up till midnight reading them. You were up reading them. Why are you saying the Vatican can't read them and make a comment?
Well, I'm saying they can read them, but I think it's important that when Rome does respond to this, and I think it will, that it responds to it in the way that Rome needs to, which is to hold bishops to account and say why weren't proper processes followed. And I think that's something that really shines through in this report, is that priests are removed from ministry, but they aren't laicized, they aren't subjected to a legal process, their files aren't sent to Rome, and that's what Rome needs to be looking at, is what was the procedure followed in all these cases and why wasn't it followed?
But by the Vatican not commenting, isn't that playing right into the problem of the Church not being transparent?
I think the Church does need to be transparent, and the Vatican does need to respond. I'm not saying it doesn't need to respond, but I'm saying that I think there's nothing to be served by the Vatican putting out a platitudinous initial statement. I think the Vatican and the Church authorities in this country will be judged by hard actions, not by words.
Thank you so much. Ed Condon, Catholic News Agency. Thank you.
Thank you.
The Archdiocese of Boston announces Cardinal Sean O'Malley will not attend next week's World Meeting of Families in Dublin, Ireland. O'Malley, who is the head of the Vatican's Clergy Sex Abuse Commission, was supposed to moderate a panel at the event, but will instead stay in Boston to focus on an investigation into alleged sexual misconduct at St. John's Seminary. Our teams across EWTN are continuing to cover all aspects of the sex abuse scandals. Stay with EWTN News Nightly, as well as the Catholic News Agency and the National Catholic Register. Results are in from 4 states that held primary elections yesterday. It was a night of firsts. Among Democrats, Christine Hallquist is the country's first transgender major party nominee for governor. She won her primary in Vermont. Johanna Hayes has the chance to be the first African American to serve in Congress from Connecticut. On the Republican side, Chris Kobach gave the president a major victory by winning the nomination for governor in Kansas. President Trump makes good on his threat to revoke John Brennan's security clearance. The former CIA director is an outspoken critic of the president, but Press Secretary Sarah Sanders said that's not why he lost his clearance. She claims Brennan leveraged his status to make a series of unfounded and outrageous allegations. Sanders also says the security clearances of other officials, including fired FBI Director James Comey, are under review. The White House is expressing frustration again that American pastor Andrew Brunson remains on house arrest in Turkey, despite repeated demands for his release.
Turkey, and specifically President Erdogan, have treated Pastor Brunson, who we know to be a very good person and a strong Christian who's done nothing wrong, very unfairly, very badly, and it's something that we won't forget in the administration.
Brunson is on trial on espionage and terror-related charges, which he and the U.S. government adamantly deny. The U.S. slapped sanctions and tariffs on Turkey over his detention. The move triggered a currency crisis, and the country retaliated with increased tariffs on some U.S. goods. A mysterious Russian satellite is sounding the alarm bells at the State Department. Officials are warning the international community has no way to tell if a satellite could be used as a weapon. Correspondent Wyatt Goolsby has the details from the State Department. Good evening, Wyatt.
Good evening, Lauren. Officials here say the Russian satellite is behaving unlike anything they've seen before. Russia insists it is not hostile, but the U.S. is calling on the United Nations to enact stricter measures for what can and cannot be placed into orbit.
We don't know for certain what it is, and there is no way to verify it.
State Department Assistant Secretary Yelena Poblete is raising serious questions about a mysterious Russian satellite at the United Nations in Geneva.
How do we verify what countries say their spacecraft are doing? What would be enough information to prove what the purpose of an object is?
Poblete says the U.S. has been monitoring the satellite since its launch in October of last year. The State Department doubts the Russian claim that it's a small inspector spacecraft. In Brazil, Defense Secretary James Mattis pushed for greater defense of U.S. satellites against threats like Russia and China.
So we have had to do a lot of work defining the problem. It has to do with 10, 20 years in the future. Where do we want to be? What is our economic dependence on space? What is our intelligence? What do we have to do if we have to make it defensible instead of just putting up satellites in a benign environment?
Mattis, who's on a diplomatic tour in South America, is also emphasizing the U.S. interest in partnering with Brazil in space research, an area in which China has shown growing influence. Some say the U.S. is playing up the Russian satellite to bring attention to the militarization of space. The Trump administration has been pushing to create a space force, but has yet to get congressional backing to form what would be an expensive sixth branch of the military.
Throughout the week, Secretary Mattis has downplayed U.S. plans to put weapons in space, but he's emphasizing the vital role of satellites, not just in military operations, but in the world economy. That includes phone communications, GPS navigation, and weather information. Lauren?
Correspondent Wyatt Goolsby reporting from the State Department. Thank you. India will send a manned flight into space by 2022. The country's prime minister made the announcement during Independence Day celebrations in New Delhi. India would be the fourth country to achieve the feat after the U.S., Russia, and China. And one of China's best-known Buddhist monks resigns after facing allegations of sexual misconduct. He is accused of asking for sexual favors from nuns at his Beijing monastery and embezzling funds. He denies the allegations. The case is seen as a sign the #MeToo movement is gaining momentum. China has roughly 250 million Buddhists. Pope Francis names a longtime diplomat as the deputy of the Vatican's Secretariat of State. Archbishop Edgar Peña Parra is a member of the Holy See's diplomatic corps. The 58-year-old Venezuelan native has served in 7 countries, including Pakistan. Archbishop Peña takes over from Cardinal Giovanni Becciu, who is set to lead the Congregation for the Causes of Saints. Coming up, a behind-the-scenes look inside a church in Rome where the founder of the Jesuits is buried. And EWTN marks an important milestone. Pilgrims in Kosovo celebrate the Feast of the Assumption by carrying a wooden icon of a black Madonna. Thousands gathered in the small Catholic community of Letnica. It is the site where Mother Teresa is believed to have heard her calling to become a nun. Rome has nearly 1,000 churches throughout the city, and one of them has a machine dating from the 17th century, and that's where we find Vatican correspondent Juliette Lindley.
Inside Chiesa del Gesù, the first church of the Jesuits, every day at 5:30, a spiritual show begins. Lights turn on, a voice projects loud through speakers hidden in the church's ceiling. And attention turns to this altar, where Jesus is seen giving the flag of his mission to St. Ignatius, painted by Jesuit brother Andrea Pozzo in 1695. Jesuit father Jean-Paul Hernandez is an art theologian at the church.
St. Ignatius of Loyola is the founder of the Jesuits, and he wrote an itinerary, a spiritual path to allow each one to come more in intimacy, in a deeper intimacy with the Lord.
Visitors listen attentively as the narrator begins to tell the story in Italian of St. Ignatius of Loyola, who is buried at the altar just below the painting.
Well, all this movement comes slowly down at a certain time which what we call macchina barocca, which is a Baroque machine with pulleys and ropes. At that time it was amazing, and this picture comes down, and what can we see? The statue of the saint, the statue of Saint Ignatius.
Visitors are often surprised by the spiritual show. What we see here today is actually a silver-plated stucco copy of the sculpture that dates back to the 1800s. The original, that was made of solid silver, was melted down by Napoleon's occupying forces back in 1798. Francis, the first Jesuit pope, has visited this church several times, including on St. Ignatius' feast day at the end of July. In Rome, Juliette Lindley, EWTN News Nightly.
Up next, advice from Pope Francis on how to get to heaven. And my commentary, a message to church leaders in the wake of another clergy sexual abuse scandal.
Nell'odierna solennità dell'Assunzione della Beata Vergine Maria,
the Holy Father talks about heaven on this feast of the Assumption. He says God saves the whole person, body and soul, just as he did with the Virgin Mary. Pope Francis calls it, quote, our glorious destiny. 37 years ago today, Mother Angelica channeled her vision for a TV network.
Name of Jesus, who is Lord, may his eternal word be proclaimed.
On this day in 1981, EWTN aired its first program, reaching roughly 60,000 homes. And today we're the largest religious media network in the world. We reach 265 million homes in 144 countries worldwide. Finally tonight, my thoughts on the Catholic Church sex abuse crisis. I am deeply saddened and disgusted at the behavior outlined in the Pennsylvania grand jury report, not just by the abusers, but by those in charge who allowed priests to continue to minister knowing they had irrevocably harmed innocent children. 2 of my parish priests are listed. They advised me. They taught me in grade school. One was put on sick leave 4 months after leaving my parish. He was sent to another parish and promoted. He ultimately left the priesthood and received a letter of recommendation to work at Disney World. The other confessed abuse to a bishop and was transferred to my parish 1 month later. He ran our youth program. I trusted them. So did my family and friends. We could not have imagined anything like this. Despite these very personal stories, every day behind the scenes, we at News Nightly have gone to great lengths to make sure we present both sides of the controversy engulfing the church. We have interviewed cardinals, bishops, priests, sex abuse victims, and lay Catholics in order to report the truth. And it has come at a great personal toll. Like many of you, we here want answers and action. I believe we have holy priests and bishops. I believe in forgiveness. And I still believe in the Catholic Church. For all of us here at EWTN News Nightly, to all of you around the world, thank you for watching. I'm Lauren Ashburn. Let's keep in touch online. Follow me at Lauren Ashburn on Twitter and Lauren Ashburn EWTN on Facebook. Good night, and God bless you.